All right, go ahead.
All right, thanks. Sorry about the delay, everyone. All right, today is October 30th. Welcome to Biweekly SIG Auth. We have a pretty sparse agenda today. It looks like a discussion of pod security policies, the only thing on there. I will call out that we have a little more than 2 weeks coming before code freeze for 117. I believe that's November 15th. So if you have things that you're trying to get into 117, best to get those PRs out soon. All right, should we jump into the discussion then? Who put this on the agenda?
Me, Rita. Hey.
All right, Rita, were there specific questions or points you wanted to discuss on pod security policy? I know there's a bit of discussion on the issue recently.
Yeah, so it's an extension of that discussion, but wanted to hear more feedback from the community in terms of how folks are using PSPs today, and maybe also discuss the future, if people already have some thoughts around that.
Let me pull up that issue. Thanks. So last time we discussed pod security policy in SIG Auth, we talked a bit about the future of pod security policy. There's sort of periodically people ask when it's going to go to GA, and the sort of stock answer that we've had for a while now is that we're unhappy with the current design of pod security policy and don't want it to go to GA in its current form. And then there's this kind of open question of whether pod security policy should be built into Kubernetes core at all, or if we should depend on admission webhooks to supply that functionality. And we've talked before about Gatekeeper and the potential for Gatekeeper to kind of fill that niche. And also Kubernetes, if I'm pronouncing that right, has also offers some similar functionality. And the direction that both of the examples and those two projects have gone is to have separate constraints or policies for every dimension of the pod security policy object. And personally, I have some concerns about what that would actually look like in a production environment. I think you would end up with a lot of different constraints, especially as you have different applications wanting to request exceptions or things like that. And so I'm worried that the one constraint per field model will quickly get super complicated. So that was kind of the concerns that I was outlining here. Are there any other thoughts on that?
Hi, this is Chris from Twitter. I just want to say, as we're sort of exploring, large-scale production Kubernetes, this is one of the problems we do keep running.
Chris, you're a bit quiet. You could maybe kick this mic.
Is this a little bit better?
Yeah.
That's better.
Yeah, so one of the problems we run into at Twitter with kind of productionizing Kubernetes at scale is that as we've tried to make custom PSPs, for example, we basically, from an operational perspective, have had to drop back down to just having, 3 or 4 different PSPs and bucketing people. While we like the idea of having it all faceted and being able to customize it for every single workload, realistically, having 5,000 or 10,000 different policies is operationally impossible. So I think the bigger thing we keep running into with PSPs is actually how do we pilot and canary changes to them, and roll out changes to those across large numbers of jobs. So I think making it more granular actually is going in the wrong direction for us. We decided from a security perspective, it was easier to say, 80% of our jobs fall into this one bucket. 80% of the remaining jobs fall into this next bucket, right? And then we have a couple of things that need very specialized cases. Yeah, we'd rather have that 80% solution that doesn't come with a huge overhead than something that's perfect and completely impractical.
Yeah, that actually mirrors a lot of feedback we've gotten on security context constraints over the years, which is the problem is the moment you start cutting into permissions that are actually fairly broad, like privileged or netadmin, cap netadmin, or host mount with control over the SE Linux label, you've basically turned off all security anyway. And so that last 20% or 5%, depending on where the spectrum lies, is basically just only run that for validated, trusted software that's been audited, because everything, like it's almost impossible to constrain at that point. It has felt more binary over the years than it originally, we originally thought it was going to be.
I think it will be super helpful to maybe outline some of the, as you said, there are few PSPs that are used more broadly in your organization. Is it possible to maybe share what they are, just so that we can sort of understand what are the main ones that people use today?
Sure, I can talk about the two primary ones, which cover 99% of the use cases. Is literally we'll call them an unprivileged and privileged use case. And I'm going to preface this by saying Twitter has a somewhat homogeneous workload technology. Most things are on the JVM, et cetera. But from that perspective, the first one is a unprivileged container that has very limited rights to it, has access only to a very small number of things. They all run in their own namespaces, and they all run as dedicated users and all of that fun stuff. And that's what we sort of, using RBAC, dump everybody into by default. The other, as a previous person was talking, whose name I missed, is basically the privileged and sort of audited workloads. So we run a lot of daemon sets and things like that are that need access at from a capabilities perspective would need sysadmin, for example, right? So their mechanisms say, let's say, to like grab network captures for you. Those are all audited workloads, and so it's an agreement between the security team and our compute platform team that we go through and we audit those. We look at their design, make sure we keep sort of the blast radius to a minimum, and then we use RBAC to control who can have access to that. And that's actually solved like 80 to 90%. Well, actually at this point, almost 99% of all of the workloads. So that's how we've approached it. We'd started off with, I think we originally had almost a dozen different PSPs, and we just found that like the overhead of managing very small differences and therefore very small reductions in risk just was not worth it. And again, things like capsysadmin, like there's just like this gigantic hole that you can drive everything through. So the minute you need one little thing in that, right? And there turns out to be a lot of things in there that various types of, like, especially daemon set type workloads end up needing. So like we have a daemon set that makes sure that all the sysctl configurations for networks and things like that are set correctly at all times. Once you've blown that hole in it, like the benefit from a security perspective, and for what it's worth, I'm on the security team. of being able to say, oh, but you don't have this tiny other little thing. It's just not worth the overhead for us to manage that.
Yeah, I was going to add the things I've seen. So like privileged is the ultimate. Some people have tried to do like host network only. The problem is if you have host network, you usually need cap netadmin, and cap netadmin is, as far as we're concerned from like a Red Hat perspective, is effectively root, even if it's not an obvious path in most cases. And then host path, like the things that have high cardinality, like the host path allow, and the things like if you wanted to grant specific SE Linux policies, those quickly get somewhat out of hand. Those might actually be better served by a different solution separated from SCC today. And maybe that's part of like, or sorry, through PSP. And I think like that's also come up a lot. The other one I'd say is we have two sets of customers and auditors, one who believe like the most restrictive one, which is non-root user, and then some allow root in a container with proper SE Linux labels. They're, it's the difference between 99% safe and 100% safe. That one though, like, I think what we've seen a lot of is people don't know how to judge the difference in those without really good descriptions. And so having like 2 or 3 good descriptions on like standard, like I think some of this is like the tribal knowledge of what you need to audit within Kubernetes, within a PSP tied to those attributes. Even just the list of like, if you think about this profile with this level of security, here's the things you have to audit, would probably go a long way to standardizing how people think about those. Like instead of letting someone else define those for us in an audit or tribally, perhaps we could define those ourselves as recommendations for the community and for security auditors.
Yeah, I agree with that. First off, I want to say, Chris, thanks for joining us. Your user perspective is super valuable, and that's often missing from these meetings. So this is really great. Also, a lot of this sort of aligns with an idea I've been kicking around for a while of sort of 3 policy buckets. One is privileged. The other is default, which means that you can essentially run with, run a pod that doesn't specify any security context, but you can't elevate privileges from that. So basically saying the Docker defaults and more restricted, but not more privileged. And then the third bucket would be the restricted one, which limits you to run as non-root, and also puts some volume restrictions in place, maybe. I think the restricted and default ones need to be versioned, because as we add more ways to further restrict or further privilege containers, then those need to kind of stay aligned with that. Yeah, so I do like the idea of Kubernetes at least putting out a recommendation for, hey, these are the policies that, or these are the things that we think need to be restricted and audited. And then there's some question of like, well, do we build that in to core Kubernetes? Do we lean on other projects like Gatekeeper and Kverno to implement those? Or do we have our own kind of simple policy controller that implements those as a webhook?
So again, this is just sort of a user perspective, but I think if you hand people something, say you've got to go pick something that will implement these security policies, and here's 5 different projects, the choice that most people are going to make is none of the above, and therefore they're going to get nothing. And I think if we can offer a default that meets 80% and makes things 80% better, and we leave it open for organizations that either have the skills or the desires or the requirements to have, let's say, more trustworthy behavior, that's where I would like to see sort of the third-party innovation go on, right? There's been ideas we've explored about sort of how do you auto-generate a policy for someone based on their runtime behavior, right? And you sort of tighten it down and do things like that. That might be something that someone the scale of Twitter could do. It is not something the scale of someone who is just running a single Kubernetes cluster in Google, with 20 nodes is going to ever be interested in, even if we open source the tooling.
So I'm having trouble seeing how this is going to work with out-of-tree runtime classes, or how an in-tree security policy is going to work with out-of-tree runtime classes.
I guess I'm also curious, if we don't see this thing going to GA, why would we invest the time to make these changes?
So I guess the difference is this a recommendation of the things you want to stamp out for people to go and build gatekeeper or SEC policies with, or is this going to, I guess, do we have an express goal to reintegrate this? That second seems hard. I think that there's it's going to be a nuanced feature, as people pointed out. Different organizations have different personalities. I think there's a small set of personalities, but it varies by company.
You know what's interesting, Mike, and I think this is kind of getting at the heart of it, is so PSP in some respects is based on assumptions made during SEC, which was designed before Cube went GA 1.0. I think just even this discussion, if we step back and look at what we're talking about and the point about runtime classes, there's a set of objective container truths on the API that this is either safe or not safe. And there's a bunch of blurry lines for policy. I mean, maybe what we're really trying to maybe say is that there should be one or two recommended levels that we actually either hard code, or hard code's just an arbitrary statement, but an emission plugin that said you're in the unsecure or secure, or privileged or not privileged, or confined or not confined. That would probably be more useful than the general purpose PSP. And then there's a number of other elements that should be able to orthogonally work with that. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at a little bit, but.
Yeah, I think that if we had those personalities defined by name and allowed runtime class authors to build out the finer details of that, I think we get there. I think there's important integrations with scheduling. Maybe Twitter doesn't run anything that needs a raw socket, but some people do. And in a situation where you give a pod raw socket, you might not want another node to co-schedule, or another pod to co-schedule with it, depending on what that pod is handling. Or same with network admin. There's, I think, a lot of complexity comes out of examining how these policies will be used in every company's use case. So I just want to make sure that we don't lose flexibility by cutting down on the number of constraints.
Host volume is a great example of, host volume is a gap that we put in PSP that's really, in a sense, trying to work around the absence of CSI local volumes, which is a CSI local volume should be able to handle every host path in a more controlled and flexible manner, barring the ability to control who can use which CSI plugins. I guess another question I would have maybe is, one of the advantages of PSP as designed today is it does let you mutate at the fundamental level to make your workload work. If we did get even slightly more opinionated, we still need it to be flexible. Would we put the profiles in conformance? And I could go both ways. I feel like it's hard to introduce these. The struggle with PSP was bringing it to GA means probably turning something on by default, which breaks people. If we put something in conformance and it's secure and unsecure, we will get into, as Tim, as you point out, with versioning, as we add new capabilities, we will have to version that definition. And we will have to have even more of those. This is secure or not secure. I think like the net benefit of having like an out of the box or recommended profile is clear to everybody. It's what are you allowed to change within it, and how far afield do you have to go to get back to where you would be today with like PSP beta if you needed more flexibility.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also don't think that we should be trying to solve the 100% use case here. I think that's where these outside projects really shine. And anything that we're talking about kind of, even if it's on the level of documentation or endorsement or something, I think we should be focusing on kind of that, 90% use case of sort of privileged and unprivileged, maybe trying to nail down what that looks like. I don't know if there's privileged and unprivileged or privileged and default and restricted or some small number of uses there.
At least the data we have today from like OpenShift, so like over the last 6 years or so, I can probably say that the three classes I've seen are more restricted, where you can't run as root in a container, and you have an actual AppArmor or SE Linux profile that's unique to you. That's the full restricted. You can't use any of the host level things. And then there's, I think the biggest bulk is the middle, which is then you're that, but you run as root. Or you can run 0 in the container, but you have like a restrictive SE Linux or AppArmor profile, which is, and you can't do any host stuff. That's 99% of workloads. And then everything else is effective.
Yeah, the middle bucket is what I'm calling sort of the Docker default.
Yep.
Also, Mike, thanks for mentioning runtime class. I think specifically around the sandbox runtimes, so Kata containers, gvisor, that gets a bit more interesting because suddenly the privileged containers become, you can run with those things set on the pod, but you're still effectively sandboxed from the host. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that would look like from a policy perspective.
Windows as well, that it becomes a runtime. I don't know what the plans are for that.
Sorry, I missed the first half of what you said.
Windows has an entirely different set of constraints than what we expose through security context.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I imagine Windows can similarly express sort of, this is what a privileged, actually I'm not even sure they have privileged pods.
Yeah, if we delegate to, if the contract is we have these names and then it's up to the runtime class authors to decide what they mean and how to best be true to those names, like non-privileged, privileged, I think we can approach something. Yeah, it's hard. A lot of variables.
So we've gone off on a bit of a tangent here, although I think it's productive. Rita, were there more specific questions that you were looking to have answered here?
Yeah, I think this discussion is super helpful. I think like everyone else, we're looking to see like what is the current use cases, and I think having these 3 buckets well defined will definitely be a good guidance for people. And I think whether it's like PSPs or alternatives, those are kind of describing the how. And I think as a community, we need to define the what first, right? Is what are the policies and why are they there and when should you use them? And then in terms of alternative solutions or PSPs, like then whatever you want to use, you can choose the solution you want to use, right? But I think just keep in mind is, you know, we want to make sure that the solution that we offer to users is extendable, but also back to Chris's point earlier about how do I roll out canary policies in a safe manner. And I think that's a big thing that is missing today. So I don't know how far we can get to today, but another thing that I also pointed out in the issue is if PSP is not going forward, and then I think we need to also talk about migration, but that's probably way down the road.
Yeah, I agree that we certainly need to have a migration plan in place before we do anything with pod security policy. But yeah, I think that requires having the thing that we're migrating to nailed down first.
Or the multiple things.
Yeah, or the multiple things.
If David Eads wants to break out SCC, and then customers have many options, or users have many options.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do look at it and say that, you know, if there was a desire, it could certainly be made external. It's been around. It's worked for about 4.5 years. It covers, I think, most of the use cases that I heard here, and I don't know, we've been using it, like I said, for years. But
yeah, I think we need a like a plan, and I think we've been kind of twiddling our fingers for a long time, but I don't want to make David do anything that doesn't actually get used or waste effort.
I think we even have a migration tool for it, like how do you migrate from PSPs? We have a command to swap them.
So assuming we did have multiple alternatives, would we delete PSP from the Kubernetes code base? Kind of a question for maybe Tim or David or people who have been more involved in it.
If the alternative is capable of auto migration, then you just have to have a migration path for a previously embedded resource to become a custom resource, and I think you can swap them out.
I don't think we're gonna get perfect backwards compatibility. A migration tool is helpful, nor do I think we should strive for perfect backwards compatibility, considering we're not graduating it because it's lacking.
I remember looking at it and deciding I thought it was close enough for us to do to our customers, but it's been a while since I looked at it. But yeah, it was something like we seriously considered it just in the field on our boat. But
were you working on SCC to PSP or PSP to SCC?
We were trying to do a two-way, so we could force one to be a source of truth in one release, and the next one to be the source of truth in the other release. The same way when we upstreamed our RBAC work, we were able to transition to standard RBAC.
I believe this is one of the topics that will be covered in the KubeCon deep dive after Mo's poll showed that a lot of people had interest in it. So shameless plug, come to that event if you want to talk more about this.
Going back to your question, Mike, of whether we would delete pod security policy, the indefinite future of pod security policy shouldn't be that it stays as is in beta. I think we need to either come up with a plan to put it to GA or come up with an alternative and set a deprecation plan for it. So yeah, I think the eventual goal, I don't think that it should go to GA as is. And so I would say that I would like to see it eventually get deleted. And maybe there's some room for a simplified version that's built into core, sort of as we discussed earlier. But I could also equally get on board with that simplified piece being out of core. Are there any other thoughts on this topic, or should we move on to issue triage? All right, I'll take that as a endorsement for issue triage. All right, let's see.
You can assign this one to me. So in certain situations, we've seen that the LRU caches used by the token cache and the authorizing webhook cache, when the access just becomes like a scan of keys larger than how those are configured, they just fall over. So I think we picked some arbitrary sizes for those caches a long time ago. And I think we arbitrarily picked that they should be LRU caches. So I think we need to reevaluate some of those decisions. But I'm going to work on this, hopefully get something into 117.
You say important long-term, or?
Important soon, probably, to make any change, because big clusters are blowing up right now.
Sounds good. I think that Paulo is working on this. I don't know if he's on the call. I'm going to put this in backlog. I think it's important, but not sure how exactly we treat add-ons.
Don't we have a separate repo for the dashboard?
I think this is talking specifically about the add-on manifest in Kubernetes for the dashboard. Yeah, to this. I would love to see us kill off this cluster directory in these add-ons. I think
There's an issue for it.
It's not well defined.
I think right now the hardest part is just making E2E continue to work.
Yeah.
But any other usage of it is discouraged, and it actually says so in the root README of that cluster directory. So if there's stuff that tests aren't using, I would be for deleting those things.
Well, I think that's sort of outside the scope of SIG Auth. doesn't really sound like SIG Auth. I guess we need a permission for collecting core dumps, but I'm going to remove SIG Auth for now.
I thought there was a cap for this at some point. Not linked.
I definitely remember it being mentioned in SIG before. I can go and find that later.
Oh yeah, this one. I think me and David were having a conversation about why this is useful.
That looks familiar, but it looks like the sort of thing I would come in and say, I don't think you should do that. You can have a user extra if you want to. That sounds familiar to me.
Oh, I think that's what we want. I think that's what I was thinking. Add an extra info field for it.
Micah, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I think user info could be sufficient. I didn't well define what all the use cases are. So I think like Mike's use case of, especially for like the certificate approver, to only approve certificates that were made by an authentication source that wasn't a certificate would be useful. Yeah, I think user info could be sufficient, but I think not all the implications of like I think Jordan said in this, if it's a subject access review or something, what do we populate there? Like who consumes that? How do they trust it? I don't know that that's all been answered.
Yeah, I can see my comment from September 5. Very consistent. User extra. A way to do it, and then
Experiment from there. So I think the conversation petered out, and that we should just finish the conversation.
I'm going to say awaiting more evidence, since it sounds like there's debate about whether we need something here. And
I think we need something. We just don't know which thing we need. 82379. I'll poke at it after this meeting.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, Mike, feel free to ping me too.
Will do.
Is this a duplicate of that last one?
Whoa.
Yes.
Not exactly. I would actually be more in favor of allowing someone to audit it than trying to make a top-level item that we would expect infrastructure in Cube to rely on. I guess I see a distinction between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess mechanism-wise, it could be put into the user info, in which case the audit logs would capture it, or it could be put into an audit annotation.
Yeah, the user info is what concerns me, because that gets plumbed down and it says that everything in user info is accessible for authorization. So if you put it in extra, then you pair your authorizer and the authenticator, and you can decide what you want to do. But if you put it as a top-level item, then the expectation could be that core things like admission or generic authorizers would take into account differences in the way users were authenticated, and that is a very different statement than what we have today, where authentication is fully orthogonal for all stock authentication and authorization.
Micah, what was your use case for the first one?
I actually was thinking about audit because that would be really useful, I think. And also, like you said, the certificate controller. I also was sort of thinking about aggregate API server backends that might want information about how this user is authorized, but that might be outside the scope. So I think reducing the scope probably makes more sense at this point.
So we can fix audit with a audit annotation, and we can fix the certificate problem if we had a way of encoding extra info in certificates. So that would be a change isolated to the certificate, X509 authenticator, and audit, and we wouldn't expose anything new and extra info.
So I'm in favor of an audit annotation, or I find that to be reasonable. I don't know the exact coding required there, but that's also a very reasonable thing to do for audits specifically.
What about the second one?
Encoding extra. I think Jordan and I honestly both have some regrets about what we did to certificates in making groups. I can probably make peace with it and say, sure, let's abuse another field, but if Jordan's not on this call, we should probably talk that over with him, because it's not strictly normal. Right?
Yeah, do you understand the issue that or the use case I was trying to solve?
You're trying to prevent the infinite cert problem, I think. Where,
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So
I understand it. I would want to reserve further judgment until I sat down and re-thought about it, rather than go forever recorded on the internet with whatever's in the seat of my pants. So.
Right. So that is not a huge priority for me, although I would like to get an answer on it. It seems like audit is right now somewhat uncontroversial. So that can make progress independently of the certificate stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
Does anyone want to volunteer to follow up on this one?
I meant that in the abstract. I'm not going to give someone a hard time, and I would look at it for a review, but I don't think I would take up coding for it.
Micah, do you want to look at this one?
Yeah, I can take a look. This might be a post KubeCon post reInvent thing for me, but
yeah. I haven't seen this one.
This looks like a good mic issue.
You can assign it to me.
Do you want to throw an initial priority on this?
Needs triage. Not a priority. Backlog. Yeah, it's priority. Perfect.
All right. Multi-tenancy for persistent volumes.
When's the last update? 10 days ago.
Well, but none of these are real updates.
No real updates in here. I'd remove SIG Auth. Is it related to SIG Auth? Or is it covered by multi-tenancy and storage?
This looks more like applying SIG auth, so, or applying authorization, I would say. Let's leave it to SIG storage to deal with.
Sounds good.
All right. Victory. All right, these need prioritization. Is that a SIG auth issue?
No, that one looks like API machinery. It came up in our channel. They wanted to have a way for a webhook to say wait X time before calling us, and that affects SLO things.
Man, I don't know what to do about this one.
Isn't there like a much bigger discussion of this, or is this the issue?
I think there's a separate one. Yeah, might be linked. I think Jordan closed it as a duplicate and reopened this one, or is this? That might be
Close the other one as a duplicate?
Yeah, I guess this is the one.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I want people to have a good experience with projected service count tokens, but I also want them to improve on the world readable permissions that we give secrets. The right thing to do would be to create a projected volume per container and give the secret permission to the container UID. I think that's the right thing to do. We don't have the capabilities and volumes today. The options are to be more flexible, go implement that stuff, or never promote anything to GA. So we got the cap out recently for this, so now that the cap exists, it might be something worth talking about further.
Okay, yeah, it seems like we should definitely follow up on this. But for now, I'm just going to mark it as important long term. Maybe we can throw it on the agenda for a later meeting.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is, I think we've decided this is impossible without breaking someone.
Mhm.
So we might have to just deal with it.
All right.
You can probably drop us from the credential provider one. We don't own that.
Okay.
As far as I know, I don't think that code is owned by the node team.
Sounds good. All right, 3 minutes to look at open bugs. This is a new search. All right, so we have 2,276 issues to get through.
Let's call it early.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, thanks everyone.
All right, bye.
See you in 2 weeks. Actually, 2 weeks. Yeah, that's the week before KubeCon. So I think we've got one more before KubeCon. All right, take care. Bye.